Hello and welcome to our first session of this afternoon here in Eastern Time. We welcome to Climbing to Higher Ground, Rethinking Resilience. Our opening panel here is going to sort of look at, of course, the big picture issues that Kim Stanley Robinson raised in his opening keynote, looking beyond, of course, mitigation and what comes after adaptation to climate migration, in the sense that we cannot build a seawall around everything, we cannot protect everything, we cannot save everything, but we can save everyone. And so how should we begin thinking about, and how are individuals and households already thinking about the difficult decisions on how and where to live, and how we will pay for it, and all of these issues. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our opening session moderator, Alexandra Tempus, who is a writer and editor for FairWarning. Alexandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Greg. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the opening panel at Higher Ground, Rethinking Resilience. As Greg mentioned, the mandate of this panel and of this entire virtual gathering the next few days is to seriously grapple with the fact that for many, adapting to climate change will mean picking up and moving. Some to higher ground, some further inland, some from rural areas to more urban ones, some from megacities to smaller cities. Indeed, many of these places, these moves have already been underway for some time. So perhaps if you're joining us today, it's happening in the community where you live. And yet conversations that bring scholarly researchers together with the planners and the elected officials and the financial sector, and very importantly, the public, are still catching up to this new climate reality. So we're here to help fill that gap and to move beyond speculation and abstractions. We have an all-star panel here today to discuss the tools and tactics already in use by communities facing relocation, and to put a human face on this phenomenon and game out new paths forward. So again, I'm Alexandra Tempus. I'm a journalist who covers climate migration within the United States. I am joined by Jesse Keenan, Associate Professor at the Tulane School of Architecture, Missy Stults, Sustainability and Innovations Manager for the City of Ann Arbor, Michigan, Vivek Shandas, Professor and founder of the Sustaining Urban Places Research Lab at Portland State University, and Abby Hall, Senior Advisor on Local and Regional Planning at the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Community Revitalization. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
To start, let's talk about what climate migration actually looks like on the ground right now. I think the popular conception, if there is one, are the mass evacuations that happen after major sudden onset disasters like hurricanes, as we heard Mayor Dyer talk about in the opening remarks. But it can take other forms too. So what are the different ways we're seeing climate migration unfold, and how are you encountering it in your work? Abby, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, I think, our reality has shifted. Disasters are no longer these infrequent mega events only. Disasters are both big and small. They're more frequent. They're varied in the types of disasters a given community is seeing. And they're just a very real part of our daily lives now. And I think the types of climate migration match that trend in that the scales vary. You're not just seeing whole neighborhoods or communities being asked to pick up and move. There's some of that. That's certainly the sort of big, bold idea of climate migration. But there's the sort of smaller scale, the individual, more fine-grained type of climate migration that's happening. Families that are forced to or are capable of picking up and moving when they get tired of the smoke, or they get tired of the heat, or they get tired of their basement flooding. They're going to pick up and they're going to move somewhere that either feels safer or where they have family support. And I think we're already seeing a lot of that. And we certainly see that sort of manifested not only in the places that they're leaving, but the places that they're immigrating to. Other communities are starting to look at their demographic trends. Planners are used to looking at population trends and predictions, and they've always dealt with uncertainty. I work in a land use planning part of EPA, and we've been saying for years, look, you don't have to have the perfect answer on which climate scenario to pick to plan around. Planners have been thinking about demographic trends and without knowing all of the specific answers for a very long time. We need to get comfortable with that in the climate change realm as well. And so I think, one thing that the smart communities are starting to do is they're thinking about resilience almost like a campaign. And what I mean by that is you need to build a lot of different allies. You need to really listen and do trust building with people to understand what resilience means to them. When we run workshops at EPA with communities that are doing planning around disasters, we just start with a simple question of like, what do you love about your community? And what are you worried about? What do you think is at risk? And sort of pairing those questions really helps you see people know where these risks are in their communities. So you need to both listen to what people are telling you about that day-to-day impact of disasters rather than just relying on a vulnerability assessment or a climate scientist to tell you what the risk looks like. So sort of matching that on the ground experience, I think, is really important to understanding the sort of full range of scales of what we're talking about when we're starting to see climate migration.
Sorry, does anyone want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I think one thing I would add in terms of the scale and the diversity of stakeholder experience, and I think this is a reflection of actual observations based on real life set of circumstances we find ourselves in, is that we have a continuum, and on one end of the continuum we have displacement, and we understand what displacement means in a post-disaster context, or we think we do. The other end of the continuum are people who have elective mobility, who have the means. And I think that in between, there's a huge gradation and there's a huge amount of variation of what motivates people. What are the push and pull factors? And climate is usually not, I think we tend to think in very deterministic terms, that there's an event or a shock or a stress, and that is calculated in terms of people's motivation. But I think what we understand is that climate and environmental exposure is part of an environmental impact experience, et cetera, is part of a calculated set of decisions that weight with housing affordability, accessibility, wealth, and all of these other things that drive demography and mobility more formally. So I think this is such a huge undertaking, but I think in many ways offers a great deal of opportunity to engage modes of planning, policy, and understand this in the context of not just disaster risk reduction, but infrastructure, housing policy, healthcare policy, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, moving senior citizens out of South Florida to Central Florida is going to require a fair amount of healthcare infrastructure just to move the records, right? So I think that is the task upon us, is understanding these various experiences as we can sort of categorize them in terms of motivation and scale.
Right. Yeah. It makes a lot of sense what you're saying about climate being among a constellation of reasons that people decide to move. And for many people, climate migration is also overlaps with economic migration. Their job is tied intimately with the climate and the land. Does anyone else want to pick up before I move on? Missy.
Yeah, I would just add, one of the factors is as we think about receiving zones, that it's not ubiquitous either in terms of who's ready to receive. We see some communities who are raising their hand and really trying to get ahead and recruit folks. And we see others that might be highly desirable places where people might want to go that aren't quite ready to receive folks, or haven't had that conversation around what does this mean for land use? What does this mean for development patterns? What does this mean for other goals and priorities and quality of life? And so there's a lot of tension across, I think, the entire spectrum. And Jesse was identifying this gradation of why people move, how they move, when they move. And I think there's a similar gradation in terms of where they may be going and how receptive and ready those places will be.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because that leads right into my next question, which was for you, Missy, about receiving cities. And you've talked about Ann Arbor being a climate haven, a place that people might move to. What's it like to plan for this? And what are the conversations you're having at a community level?
Yeah, it's a really good conversation question, and the conversations are really rich and intriguing. So I'm just going to kind of ground this in saying our community recently passed a pretty progressive plan called A20, which is how we're going to become carbon neutral as an entire community in the next decade. And that's insanely beautiful and audacious. And one of the key strategies in there is around resilience, acknowledging the climate is already changing. We're already experiencing impacts and we have to address those. And so when we look at our primary vulnerabilities locally, really it's about precipitation and an increase in precipitation. And so that's what we mostly talk about. You know, people think about flooding. We've had over a 30% increase in precipitation falling every year over the last 30 years. That's a lot of water, right, on our system. So people kind of start from that perspective. And then we tee up, wow, let's think about this from a national perspective. We have a water problem, and that's too much. Let's talk about places that don't have enough. What do you think is going to happen? Because water is life, right? You have to have water to be able to survive. And we've got these beautiful Great Lakes around us, the largest source of fresh water. Plus, we have the largest living alumni base from the University of Michigan in the world. So what do you think would happen if people are starting to face risks and threats? Do you think they might be interested in coming to a place like Ann Arbor? And so we start to have those community conversations, and people, really start to sit with that and think that could make sense. You know, we win awards for high quality of life, but what would that mean for social services? And what does it mean for physical infrastructure? If our infrastructure is already taxed with current climate impacts, what's going to happen if we have a population expansion on that? And so we've started normalizing a conversation, just having it and openly discussing it. And then we're starting to get to a point now working with folks like Dr. Matt Hauer to understand what might demographic shifts look like, so I can factor them into regional planning models. Because I can get, for example, my water treatment plant future projections for precipitation changes, so they can do modeling of what we need to design a future water treatment plant for, but it won't matter if it's undersized. So we just don't even have data to make that. And that's where we are at this point, is trying to get the information that we can integrate. Even though it's going to be wrong, it could be directionally right and give us a sense for what we might have to start investing in.
Right. And on that point about, data you can use, Vivek, through your lab, you've been developing tools that help communities improve decision making. Can you talk about how we might measure exposure to harmful climate impacts, how that can influence decisions to move, thresholds, things like that?
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Ali. Just to add to the ongoing conversation, I just might want to just take a step back before getting into that, because what this issue brings up, and it's such an intersectional issue for me, is issues of uncertainty, which Abby touched on in the opening remarks. And my observation is that Western Europe and much of North America is really not comfortable with notions of uncertainty. We are just really hell-bent on trying to make sure we dot every I, cross every T, and find the solutions that are so trusted and so kind of airtight that allow us to be able to take action. And we're almost unable to take action without having this level of certainty that provides us some level of assurance that whatever we're investing our time, our resource, our energy into, that we can then move forward with a sense of stability and assurance. And what the pandemic and what we're seeing now is that notions of uncertainty are already relatively fragile, and notions of certainty are already relatively unable to be captured in the kinds of models or applications and even tools that we have immediately at our disposal. So just to kind of think about that for a little bit, the tools we're really thinking about is what are the ways we can really capture notions of uncertainty in this work. And we characterize uncertainty in these kind of three domains that we tend to lean into. One is this notion of ethical uncertainty, the notion of like, what does it mean if there are larger numbers of people coming in? And currently we know that when lots of people, especially with capital and can move, we know that we know who's disproportionately affected by some of those, that new money and that new development that happens in neighborhoods that often have the lowest bid price, lowest rents, and those places get increasing pressure to develop. And so do we have an ethical obligation to kind of think about communities that are going to be either gentrified, pushed out of long-lasting, long-established social bonding and bridging networks that have been established in place? And so this notion of ethical uncertainty is one that we talk to planners about, of understanding who are the benefactors and those who are burdened with potentially new folks moving into a region, or at the same level those folks that choose to leave a region and what happens in those places where you suddenly see a large amount of tax base and a lot of resources lost from a particular place. And just to touch on the two other uncertainties, which I think are relatively straightforward in the tools that we're exploring, is notions of option uncertainty, thinking about the consequences of taking different options or scenarios. So what we do a fair bit of is trying to understand what are the scenarios, say that we have a rapid growth or a pulse migration option, or say it's a slow, gradual increase, but it's at a higher rate than we've had before. What does that mean in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of the schools, in terms of all the supporting services that are available for a community to be able to actually thrive and survive in a place? And then finally, this last area that we spend a fair bit of time on uncertainty is this issue of kind of knowledge state uncertainty. And that's where like the agent-based models and these different tools that we're using really help us understand what's the state of knowledge, where's the data for this kind of work, to be able to identify some of the trends that we're noticing. And that admittedly is one of the most anemic areas of development right now, because we're starting to get just little bits of data about movement, but it's still relatively hard to get a good grasp on, as I think others were alluding to, why people are moving and the extent to which climate has induced some of that, or extreme events or something like that has induced some of that movement. So I'll leave it at that, at least as three larger concepts of uncertainty that are really driving many of the tools that we're using in this work.
And to pick up on that, and something you were talking about uncertainty at the beginning made me think about at EPA, I've been working for years. I started out my career working on green infrastructure for managing stormwater. And in the early days of green infrastructure, we just had all of this resistance from the engineers who were like, there's too much uncertainty about these plants. A pipe, you can just design that pipe for exactly what you want. You know exactly how it will work. You know how long it will last, and we know how to maintain it. Like, stop talking to us about plants and soil. That is too much uncertainty. There's not enough data. Well, now, 10, 12 years later, we have a lot of data. We know how these green infrastructure systems perform, but there are now whole new questions. But I think there is just this discomfort with solutions that we all, or many of us may know, have multiple benefits. They can really work. It can improve our quality of life. But it's not the same as what we are used to. And so there's sort of this cultural coming around that we have to get people comfortable with some of these newer approaches. But I say green infrastructure as an example because I noticed some of the chat is bringing up green infrastructure solutions, which are great, which solve some of our problems with multiple disasters, whether heat or flood or drought. And I think one of the new challenges around green infrastructure, which I've been excited to work with our partners over at FEMA, especially around the BRIC program, is looking at, they call it nature-based solutions of how can we really be investing in green infrastructure. And I'm really interested in investing at it at a larger geographic scale across a region. I'm doing a project right now with the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District, where they have a broad region-wide long-term resilience plan where they're sort of thinking of it as asset management. How do they start to pull flow off of their entire system around the region to think about what they don't know is coming down the line over the next 50 years in terms of water issues, both in terms of how much wastewater input they're going to have with a growing population, as well as, changing water regimes with precipitation and drought and all the things that are coming our way with climate change. But it is a hard conversation because sometimes they're investing in a community over here which doesn't have flood problems, but they're investing in green infrastructure because it benefits the entire system because they know they're going to have flood problems way over here in 25 years. And so it's a hard conversation, but they've got good, strong-willed staff who are really dedicated to both looking long-term and looking at the whole system and thinking about improvements and investments that will be able to absorb whatever changes come their way.
I think Abby's bringing up some really good points about systemic change, and I want to pick up on something Vivek said quickly, which is the uncertainty is something we deal with all of the time in decision making. It's not a new variable, it's an uncomfortable variable, but underlying a lot of my experience at the city has been institutions aren't set up to fail, right? And so there is a fear of failure, and rightly so in many cases, right? I don't want a bridge to fail. But part of the cultural change and the fundamental transformation that we need to set up is giving permission to think differently and try differently and be okay. Failure, defining failure is when you do something and you don't learn from it. But we learn far more from what does not work than we do from what does. So setting up systems, part of what we've been thinking about in our journey is how do we set up permission for people to experiment, for people to try new things and explore. And Abby's point about the team that's doing the green infrastructure work is key to that. They're thinking about scale, they're testing new solutions. That's not really how most of our institutions have been set up. And so I think there's this thematic element to me around transformation of how we do our work that's essential and how we reward our innovators in this landscape.
Yeah, I think the uncertainty component is also very interesting from a broader public policy and environmental regulation point of view as well. Because, the flip side of that in policy terms is the precautionary principle, right? And the extent to which you engage in somewhat preemptive terms. But, a lot of our scientific regulation is engaged on measures of uncertainty. And there's an advantage to that on some level because it's difficult to move backwards in policy, right? Because you have that scientific certainty to rest upon. But I think we have to acknowledge that our environmental regulation is largely in a previous generation oriented around regulation for the environment. And I think as we move into climate change, we have a different discourse, which is kind of regulation from the environment, right? And the stationarity and the principles of conservation that are critically important, certainly in terms of environmental quality, do not always work in terms of the dynamic nature from which we find ourselves, whether that's range shifting and population change or design event parameters from a material point of view. And I think, when we think about the future of environmental regulation, we can think about this particularly in the context of Missy and receiving cities, and we think about the opportunity for sustainability. I think we also have to think about where are those exit ramps that not only support the experimentation, which is critical because the experimentation provides an underlying empirical validity for one way or the other, but I think it's also critically important to recognize that the stationarity of current environmental regulation is going to inhibit us from doing a lot of what we want to do. And a lot of people have always asked me over the years, how's Netherlands do this and that, and they big part of it is marketing. The second part of it is, well, they actually rolled back an awful lot of environmental regulation to get done what they needed to do. I'm not necessarily advocating for that, but I think we have to really understand that the nature of how we think about environmental quality in more dynamic terms, and certainly people have made this argument in terms of adaptive management for many years, but we really have to think this through, I think, on a more localized mode of interpretation, or regulation and enforcement.
So how do we move past uncertainty and start to take action? Are there tools that we can use to, help us guide our decisions, even when the data isn't maybe correct, but directionally right, as Missy was saying? How do we move forward with a certain amount of uncertainty, as we'll be required to do in the coming years?
I might just start with that question around the notion of institutional siloing that I've observed across the communities I've worked in. And part of the challenge here is that we've seen whether, again, I come back to the pandemic because it's been so instructive in terms of our ability to respond to something that's been relatively sudden, very far reaching, and incredibly acute in terms of impacts. And so very similar in terms of thinking about climate migration, thinking about beyond resilience concepts is the extent to which we have made a relatively fragile set of institutional systems that manage a lot of the infrastructure that we have in our communities. And so I have one foot in my service as chair of an urban forestry commission for the city. And one of the things that I'm constantly trying to do is get in front of commissions and planning staff in other bureaus. Like, I have to take it upon myself to go to the city commissioners to talk to them about how do I get in front of planning? How do I get in front of transportation? How do we all actually have that conversation so that the advisory committees aren't also siloed within individual bureaus, and that the only information we get to work with and make recommendations around are from one singular source of knowledge, and rather to think about what are the means and what are the pathways, the kind of mechanisms by which institutions at the local level can be more fluid and more flexible and more capable, as Missy was describing, to have permission to actually explore these different avenues by which they can have more integrated conversations about these intersectional issues such as climate migration. And so that's, in terms of the kind of classic sense of resilience and kind of going beyond resilience, there is a direct association in my mind to the notions of kind of connectivity in there. And one of the principles I think I'd kind of keep coming back to is the extent to which communities are highly connected in at least this institutional sense, so that we know that if there are threats that are coming forward, there is a means by which existing institutions, not necessarily new ones, can find a way to really work together to address this issue. So just starting with that piece.
I'll pick up there because I work for, of course, a large bureaucracy, and we like to stay in our silos in some ways. But a lot of the work I do using this regional resilience toolkit, which was a joint EPA FEMA project, it's all the sort of term of art is plan integration. That's what FEMA likes to call it, because they recognized, some time ago that to get to really effective hazard mitigation as action, as they call it, it can't just come from the hazard mitigation plan, which is owned by the emergency managers in a community. They need to see resilience actions built into land use plans, transportation plans, the housing plan, the capital improvement programs. And so that's a lot of what I do in my partnership with FEMA, is try to look for those different plans that communities are working on and embed resilience actions into those. And one thing that I've heard from communities for years is, please don't come in and tell us to write a new separate climate adaptation plan. We already have so much planning we have to do, that we're required to do, to access funding. Help us build these actions into it. And it's funny you say that, Vivek, about bringing different departments together, because sometimes I think my sole job in the technical assistance projects that I do with communities is just like getting this guy to talk to that lady, and they work in the same city. You'd think that they engage with each other and sit down with their plans and compare notes, and that just doesn't happen on a day-to-day basis in many communities. And so that's a big first step. And going back to something I said at the beginning about thinking about resilience as a campaign, I think that's part of it. Talking about resilience in terms that everybody can see themselves in, that they can leave their silos and all agree to a common resilience set of priorities that we need to work on now. And then they can go back in their silos and use whatever language they use. They can call it a hazard mitigation action, or they can call it a climate adaptation action, or they can call it a long-term asset management approach. Whatever terms people need to go back in and apply for their grants or tap into their existing city budgets, that's fine. But like coming together at first to say, what are we really facing now? What are our biggest priorities? Let's go work on those and make sure to embed them in both those long-term 25-year plans, but also this year's annual budget planning. And I'll end on this in saying that the other person to make sure you bring to the table, especially at the community level, is like your city manager, whoever owns your budgeting process, and make sure that you are at the table in that budgeting process to make sure that all of the money that is spent locally is thinking about resilience and is embedding these, not only the ideas, but then these specific actions. And it doesn't have to be a whole separate thing over here. It should become part of the day-to-day business.
So I think this is a very productive conversation in terms of mainstreaming climate adaptation planning and various exercises of the different categories of resilience. And there are different types of resilience. There's disaster and engineering resilience, there's ecological resilience. We have more normative forms of what we call community resilience, this pushing forward aspects. And these things, I think, are reaching a certain level of maturity, both in terms of plan design and execution and some measure of implementation in terms of interventions. And this is critically important. But I think it's also worth reflecting that in the context that brings us here today, if we think about this in a kind of unidirectional or institutional frame that thinks about shock stress and its relational byproduct and what that means in terms of people, we often pivot ourselves in the language of history and in the language of experience without necessarily reflecting upon the not just deep uncertainty, but ignorance that is what faces us, and the challenge that has no historical predicate, and from which we should, I would argue, impose some type of, and you started off, Alexandra, with your, moving away from the speculative nature. But in many ways, it's the speculation that gives us the opportunity to envision, let's hopefully through measures of consensus building through communities and various stakeholders, to envision that world that we want to live in, acknowledging that there's a certain morphology in human and environmental geography and in communities themselves that really has no predicate. And if we approach this from a purely ABC, looking at this as consumer preferences, right? And thinking about this as, I want to live here, I can afford to live here. These are the associated push and pull factors. That leads us down to a certain economization of all of this that plays out in terms of city budgets and allocation of resources. But I think what we have here is a much bigger challenge in terms of, and I think the citation for regional scale is certainly one that's grossly underappreciated. And indeed, I think particularly from a state point and top-down nomothetic point of view is certainly the frontier in many ways, particularly from a financial economy. But nonetheless, the challenge is for modes of transformation. And resilience and its heuristics, that how we sort of simplify it. And I published a national survey on this, and what people have a lot of different definitions, but most of what people mean, it comes from the realm of disaster and engineering resilience, which is a kind of elasticity to the pre-perturbation status quo. It's a kind of fairly conservative idea in many ways. It's about preservation, stability, recovery, and those are all important things. But I think what we have, and one of the reasons we have a CLI-FI keynote is because this is about transformation from which we have no idea where we're going. And we have to utilize the tools and the language and the literacy that we have amongst ourselves and degrees of institutional transparency to paint that palette of a place of where we want to live. And I think that that is the challenge in many ways that brings us here today.
I have a bazillion thoughts based on this narrative, so I'm going to attempt to tie this in, going with where Jesse was. The initial thought that came to me was the importance of this transformation that Jesse spoke about, and the importance of being comfortable with disruption. And I don't mean that in terms of like natural disaster disruption. I mean us as individuals in this space being disruptors and pushing on things that are not working. And very, very clearly what we know is that the world is not static, right? That our technologies are shifting, our demographics are shifting, our political discourse is shifting, our belief in fact has shifted, sadly. And of course, our climate is shifting, right? And other variables too. And so we have to be comfortable pushing on a world that doesn't exist anymore and creating something better, because I'm not interested in signing up for what's in store right now. I don't like the inequalities that are being exacerbated. I'm not okay with systemic racism and institutional racism that exists. I'm not okay with climate change. And so I can't be complicit in that system. So that means that those of us who are thinking about this have to push on those various systems. And to Vivek and Abby's point, I think about silos have historically played a function in bureaucracies, allowing deep knowledge, expertise to function in certain places. And I think there's probably some utility in a bit of that, but I think about it as permeable silos. How do we make sure that we have this networking that happens across those, and we allow people to be experts in urban forestry, but that's not an excuse not to understand racial inequality. And that's not an excuse to not think about urban heat island effects and migration patterns. Like you have to permeate that. And I think one of the roles of folks in this space is to be that collaborator, to bring those people together to have these conversations. And that is perhaps the most important thing. I've been with the city for almost 2.5 years, is building the relationship with my fire chief and the police chief and my community, and not just in my institution, but outside my walls, with my community-based organizations who understand this issue far more intimately than I ever will. I do not know what it is like to be a low-income Black woman in America, but I know people who do, who live that experience and can bring that discourse into the work that we're doing and talk about what this topic means for them in a very different way than I can ever articulate. And so I think as we're talking about breaking down silos, it's not just within our institutions, it's fundamentally in terms of also how our institutions work on the inside and outside. That was a tirade. I'm going to stop.
Thanks, Missy. I was hoping you would add to that conversation. I think that what I'm hearing is that there's a need for sort of not just a separate siloed off climate plan, but integrating it into all parts of our vision for our communities, and also keeping space open for speculation, for transformation, for experimentation. Certainly that still plays a role, and we're going to have to explore. I'm wondering, we've been talking a lot about community leaders and engaging people, who do all aspects of planning and engagement. I'm wondering, how do we engage the public on all of these issues? People who are residents who are just concerned about what's going on in, where they live, who might consider moving, who are worried about heat or wildfire after the summer we had, or flooding, in riverine communities. This is not just we've been talking about retreat, but it's not just a coastal concern either. So, I mean, how should we go about, including the public in this conversation, allowing them to lead the conversation even? I'll let whoever just take it.
I really appreciate this question, Ali. And to kind of build on Missy's suggestion and provocation, the idea that communities really are at the need to center communities who have been historically and disproportionately affected by a lot of the existing policies and structures that we have, I think is kind of the place from which we want to lead around this. And if that's true, and if we really take that to be something we value and we put forward as a principle, that the systems are not working for a vast majority of communities in the US, then we have to start thinking about this tension that I've also picked up on around the notion of expertise. And where does this notion of expertise really reside? And if we're wanting to be serious about the lived experience of a community member that is undergoing some massive threats, from whether it be wildfires, intense and increasing frequency of heat waves that they're trying to cope with, then this notion of what does that lived experience help inform about coping in specific places, and what are needs that a community might have that might be in some way ascendant to needs of going in and creating a whole tree planting program in a neighborhood without engaging the community in that process. And so part of where I go with the question of community knowledge and community lived experience and the expertise that we're trying to recognize that are within the community is this balance of how do you find, or even this kind of recentering of how do you find and get institutions that have been largely responsible for planning and kind of infrastructure investments to kind of pivot in a sense and put this and enable communities to really be lifted up in this process. And that is a constant tension I'm noticing, because even if it's a heat campaign that we're involved with and the immediate knee-jerk reaction is let's throw a bunch of trees at it and let's just cool off the neighborhood, and that will make this neighborhood a little more safe and secure and cooler and etc. Though that has a bunch of ripple effects that we're now seeing through green gentrification, through various other pernicious consequences that occur without actively and intensively engaging communities from their place of the lived experience and from what is it that really is needed in that community before going forward with a big climate migration safety program or something along those lines, to really trying to think about how do we ground this in the places and the people that have been historically kind of dismissed from a lot of these conversations.
I think that the phenomenological proposition that we seek in terms of engaging a diversity of experience is important, but it also become paralytic to the extent that we try to create scalable or efficient, and efficiency we can put in quotations, but we have to think about the allocation of limited resources and the advancement of adaptation and resilience and relocation and the like. And I think one of the challenges that I think is a future research question and a future question in terms of practice is, what are those modes of value homophilious language, culture? What are the things that glue us together to build the consensus necessary that define communities and our capacity and our adaptive capacity of communities to engage these things? And we were mentioning Abby's an anthropologist. There's knowledge in that coming from anthropology that's quite useful. On the other side of that, what does it mean for receiving cities? Is there a different sort of set of variables or latent or patent capacities within these communities and within these societies to be able to receive or be recipients of these new forms of social capital and relationships and knowledge and human experience? And I think that's a really interesting part. What is, you know, one of the reasons I was in my work in Duluth, Minnesota, one of the things that I was struck by in Minnesota is a kind of middle of the road state. And it's not a particularly polarized in ideological terms in terms of its public discourse. It's quite welcoming. In fact, welcoming. Indeed, we have a great amount of refugees that resettle in Minnesota. And what is it? I don't know. I don't have a question about it, but there's a kind of intuitive aspects that there are communities that have different social capacities for receiving and onboarding new people. And how does that interaction and what does that look like? And I think that's a really interesting aspect that I think will offer a little bit of insight about who we are and where we're going.
Missy, do you want to take that?
I do, yeah. I think I hear maybe incorrectly, but Jesse also talking about the transferability. Like, are there these principles? There's a question of kind of like scale. What can we learn across the entire spectrum? And then there's this question of in a place and what needs to happen. And when I heard Vivek speak, I mean, my heart was aflutter in what he was saying, because what I hear are principles of targeted universalism. I hear a concept of let's go to the people who've been hurt the worst and first in our extractive economy and in the way that we operate, and let's elevate their needs and their concerns and their lived experience and find a solution, because I can almost guarantee what we find that works for them will work across the spectrum for other folks, right? In an alternative way, this rising tide really does raise all ships, and not in the way that we're sad and migrating about, but in a way that's good. So I'm really excited about thinking how we change the entire narrative of how we work. I can't work with every community, but I can choose my low income and minority communities to be the areas we work first. And I can choose to compensate them for their time and their experience and their expertise they're giving to me, as opposed to continue to extract from it. And I can choose to develop programs where their voice is front and center and give up my role as an expert in that. The expertise I can bring is maybe authenticity to a conversation. Maybe that's what I bring, instead of, look how smart I am because I understand migration. I don't know what it's like to be them. And I'm really excited about being deeply uncomfortable in those conversations and learning, because I'm just excited about that.
And I think if the pandemic's done one good thing for us, is I think it's sort of thrown out some of the old planning tools of how we do engagement, how we host a 5 to 6:30 meeting at City Hall with a PowerPoint presentation. If we could get rid of that, hallelujah. That is not what people show up to and really deeply and meaningfully engaged with. And if they do, it's the same 3 people you always see at those meetings and the same 3 points they're making. So I think I've seen one sort of big shift in just the way that we've run some of our technical assistance. I mean, we did a project with the Shoshone Bannock tribes, and we used their Facebook page, which they use all the time. And we ran a Facebook Live event, and because it was a space that they owned and it's Facebook and people know how to chat and talk to each other on Facebook, it was very active. We didn't own it, they own the space. And I think that's a big lesson. The good thing about, people who are sort of frontline communities impacted by climate change is they're not some sort of faceless, unaffiliated, dispersed group of people. They have affiliations and organizations that, you mentioned community-based organizations, Missy. They're out there. You may not know who they are from your bureaucratic coast in a government agency or something like that, but somebody knows who they are. And meeting people where they are and where they're comfortable, where they feel safe, that's the right place to engage them. And making sure that drives these conversations, I think, is really key. Vivek and I are actually both collaborating on a project in the Portland, Oregon metro region around extreme heat and wildfire smoke impacts to public health. And so, we're reaching out to a farm workers organization because they're out there in the smoke and the heat working all the time and have very little protections. We're talking to the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon, which has, offices in communities that are all concrete, that are very hot. They know what those felt experiences are. They are an avenue. They are trusted colleagues to us, and they are trusted representatives of some immigrant population communities in Oregon. And we're also working with some service providers who work with homeless populations throughout Oregon who have all sorts of felt impacts from both the fires, from the smoke, from the heat. So that's like the first set of conversations we're having on this project. And then we're going to go talk to elected officials, and then we're going to go talk to the planners, and like being able to carry those stories in and maybe bring some of those folks in directly to share their own stories. And that's what should be driving this process alongside the maps, right? We want to have the good data that tells us what's coming, but you have to weave these things together to tell a full story.
So a number of years ago, so there's the world from which you all are leaders in engaging and driving a certain level of knowledge translation in the form of advocacy and action. And that's a critical element. But when we think about modes of agency and our capacity to control and be controlled, oppressed or not, there's another form from which we have some mode of action, engagement, and regulation, but which we have very little understanding. And that's a kind of financial economy. And a number of years ago, I had interviewed some institutional investors in Orlando, in the Central Florida area, who were making long-term land acquisitions associated in their portfolio with no as of right, development capacity, very limited, immediate plans for development. But they recognize, and this was more than a decade ago, that Central Florida was going to be the beneficiary, if you will, of an outflow of migration from South Florida. And that stuck with me for many years in terms of thinking about this megapolis between Orlando, Tampa, and Gainesville. And in fact, when Greg and I were thinking about this, what brings us here today, over almost 2 years ago, this was what was in the back of my mind, which was that, there is this financial economy. There is discounting behavior. Buyers and sellers, renters are caught up in this, even in ways that we are not fully just now beginning to understand. We have now signals from mortgage markets and capital markets that risk premium and pricing. So if you think things are, if we have some agency and capacity to engage these things in more less fragile ways, and more orderly reordering of our lives and our livelihoods and our communities, there's this other component, which is the tailwind or the headwind, depending on how you look at it, which is this world of financial economy that is increasingly driving a new world order of climate pricing, and is, I think, in many ways, underpinning much of what brings us here today.
Thank you, Jesse. I just wanted to quickly, I think I'm going to move on to some audience questions now, but I just wanted to quickly touch on something Abby was mentioning about meeting people where they're at, and sort of going to the forums that are already in use and lively discussions and meetings and organizations that are already existing. I've seen this play out with the as you panelists may be aware, and you listening may be aware, and shout out to the Anthropocene Alliance and their Higher Ground initiative. They're a network of flood survivors, and I've seen, just working with that initiative, have seen their Facebook groups. There are so many existing Facebook groups of community flood survivors, people just talking about how they got through a flood in their town, and it's an ongoing thing. It's happening years after the flood. They're still sharing stories and talking about how to get around problems. So, those kinds of spaces are really essential. And I think such a wise point about tapping into where those conversations are already happening instead of trying to reinvent the wheel. Okay, I just wanted to start. So I guess one of the first comments we got at the top of this discussion was from Robert, who is a planning student. He said, shouldn't all places be considered receiving zones? And then also, what work has been done towards guiding development, housing and other infrastructure towards areas in each region that can be considered a viable receiving zone? So I guess maybe, Missy, do you want to talk about what makes a receiving zone? Why is a place like Ann Arbor a good receiving zone?
Yeah, well, that's just from sort of a very narrow perspective. So I can't wait to hear what Jesse and Vivek say more broadly. One the factor for me would be risk. We don't want to put people in really risky situations. And we do actually have some data that shows people move from a risky situation to a risky situation. And so thinking about the intentionality of where people are going, is there a way that we could help incentivize people to go to safer places? There's a whole bunch of reasons why people do what they do. It's very, very complicated. But when we think, at least from my perspective, about the intentionality of being a receiving zone, I really do want to put people in a place that is safe, healthy, they can be happy, they can have high quality of life. Like those are variables I care a lot about. So that's what we think about from the Ann Arbor perspective. Also, I don't know if anyone's seen the very cheeky, I think it's Popular Science piece where they show climate risks across the US, and it's like this little map. I'll have to drop a link for everybody, it's fun. The result is, it looks like we're all moving to Michigan, which is sort of cheeky and fun, but there's some truth to the fact that our climate risks are a lot less than other areas. And so from a climate perspective, long-term, it can make a lot of sense to be in a place where you're not dealing with sea level rise and extreme heat at the same level. Land use perspective is difficult. And I'm just gonna throw this out there and then I'll stop and say, how do I frame this? Let me start from this perspective. When we were doing our carbon neutrality work, we had probably a 49.5% to 15.5% divide in our community between, well, one of the easiest ways to achieve it is you just stop developing, right? Like don't allow any more development, because then we put a bubble around our community and we can address it that way. And other people saying, well, no, wait, like the best approach is we have better density and better transit, so bring people in. And that's not a conversation that people agree on. There's very different divides. And so if you can't even have an open, active conversation about what your community looks like and land use patterns from that perspective, many places are going to struggle with saying, let me get all the land use in order to receive people in a sustainable, equitable, just way. So I think the point of that was to say it's actually really, really complicated. And I don't know that there are a whole lot of places that universally and ubiquitously raise their hand and say, we're ready, come in, like the development is set, it's net zero energy builds, it's all out of the floodplain, we can receive you. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I do want to keep it moving to the next question because we have a couple and we are down to 8 minutes left here. This one might be good for you, Jesse. Paul Croce in the Slack had said, isn't this where government can play a useful role, direct public attention to a public good and create a level playing field for private interests to contribute toward that public good without any one private enterprise overextended? That's a prime way to channel the flow of money into a universally useful set of investments. Do you want to talk a little bit about, finance and lending in the context of climate risk?
It's an interesting question, perhaps more academic than as is underlying to our practical considerations here. But let me foreground what is in process now. Roughly half the US housing market is controlled through government-sponsored entities, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. It's a vast majority of our household wealth, as unequal as it is distributed today. And we are on the verge of pricing climate risk in that market. It's going to accelerate inequalities associated with redlining or blue lining, as I have called it, in terms of the behavior associated with credit underwriting. It's going to exacerbate a rapid devaluation of people's wealth in high-risk areas from which they may or may not have been particularly well-informed consumers. They may or may not have had any underlying intent except to be born in the wrong place at the wrong time. We are going to have to unwind an enormous capital structure of global, the single most liquid assets in the world after US Treasuries are GSE agency debt and securities rather. So It is an enormous task, but I think one from which the Biden administration will be laser focused in thinking about the underlying equitable implications about how we unwind and price and reprice risk in climate to change behavior and to think about public goods. And part of this exercise is going to require greater investment in state and local, and particularly local infrastructure investment to help transition away from these high risk areas from which capital markets will abandon. And COVID certainly lays that bare now. Vast majority of infrastructure is paid for locally, not from the federal government. And so the federal government is going to have to play a very important role. But with that comes a very interesting set of politics about preemption and the capacity from which home rule will be in conflict with larger prerogatives for the deployment of this infrastructure in this capital. And these are politics which we will not resolve today, but it is certainly something that is in mobilization or is mobilizing now. And in the coming years, I think we will see greater resolution about where this is heading. But as it stands now, the situation is quite dire.
Thank you. Yeah, we had a comment here that touches on sort of how COVID lays bare some of the climate challenges that we're facing. Jill Rundle wrote that as a sometime resident of Central Florida, plus with an active land and water conservation role in the northern tier forest of New England, I have seen both the sea level change and weather impacts in the tropical zone and the inflow of new residents in the north driven by COVID. But it could be argued that the genesis of COVID is a result of some of the pressures created by climate shifts. Our consideration of climate change tends to focus on local weather as the catalyst for climate migration. In fact, immigration and migration is driven by the climate change effect on resources that lead to local demographic changes, crop failure, water depletion, temperature increase, which become regional, then global, and drive the migration of both humans and natural systems. It could be argued that major conflict areas and also zones of significant environmental depletion have their basis in climate effects on resources like food and water. I just offer that. I read that because I thought it was a very thoughtful comment, but I also wanted to see if any of you have a reaction to that, want to hop in and respond.
Certainly transnational migration and climate migration is part of, it's at the heart of what brings us here today. I think much of the focus today is on much more localized notions of migration. And so that continuum that I identified earlier in terms of displacement and elective mobility, I think works in another axis of scale and geographic scale. And certainly when you look at the crisis on the Mexican border and in Central America, and elsewhere, we can understand that climate and environment play critical roles in shaping people's decisions and how they are engaged in matters of due process. But right now, the consensus among the much of the scientific community that in its relatively early stages now suggests that in the coming decades, much of what we will be speaking of in terms of climate migration will be from within countries.
I might just quickly add to that, as somebody who whose family pulled him from his friends and extended family in a part of Asia and migrated to the US, a few things really come to mind in terms of transnational migration, namely that there are a series of policies that were promulgated in the US that have created greater instability in other parts of the world that have whether led to salinization of soils or depletion of nutrients in soils that have created more hardships on farmers and other industries that have kind of catalyzed a need to move from a region because their economic systems are just not really able to compete on that global market. And so what you see in a lot of these situations of transnational migration, like my own case and point, is that the systems that are attempting to maintain a level of coherence and a level of stability are often fractured by specific policies that have been, whether it's structural adjustment policies that have been promulgated by multilateral lending firms or other systems, it is something that we are now have documented pretty extensively across the at least global studies and international studies literature to understand how these migration patterns are not just a result of climate, but a result of the practices that are happening in place that then couple and cascade to create these net migrations that we're observing, again, at the transnational level and probably likely at the national level as well.
Yeah, to Vivek's point there, wonderful point, because it really hits home in what we know about what's going on in the Caribbean, which I think we'll have in Orlando as the site of what brings us here today. That what's going on in the Caribbean right now is exactly to Vivek's point, is going to shape by some measure the future of Orlando one way or the other. And it's a tremendous body of knowledge that we have much to learn.
Well, thank you all. We have reached our time. I see Greg hopped back in. Greg, I just want to thank you all for your participation. This was a super fascinating discussion, and I'm sure we all learned a lot from each other. Greg, I'll let you take it.
Thank you, Allie, and thank you all so much to my panelists. This is a fantastic start to the conference and really covering all the overarching issues. And of course, our task among the many tasks outlined here is to start weaving these together throughout our other sessions as well. So I look forward to carrying this further. We're going to take, of course, a break here, the virtual world, for 30 minutes to allow you to check your email, use the bathroom, and stretch your legs. And then we'll return at 2 o'clock. With our next session, Cities on the Hill, and getting into some of course, the design questions. And again, as I think as Jesse mentioned here, that we're focused on local issues, but also looking at local migration, regional migration, transcontinental and sort of, and to some level international as well. But looking at this notion of, who's going to move, but where should they move to, and how do we design these places for them? And of course, as always, how do we pay for them? So we'll get into that momentarily. But thank you all again to our panelists. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Allie, for moderating, and we'll see you all back here shortly. Thanks so much.